Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Minton, Chief Executive of CPA, Construction Plant Hire Association. Welcome to this webinar, which is about hiring into the EU. We have just one speaker today, Holly Tong of Brightfinch Limited. Holly will be talking us through the procedures and processes that hire companies need to take account of to hire into the EU now that we have finished the transition process. But firstly, some admin. Please keep your mic muted. We will have time for questions and answers before the end of the webinar after the main presentation. But if you do want to ask a question for clarification during the presentation, please wave your hand or use the Zoom raise hand function, or you can use the chat function to let us know, and then I will come to you to enable you to answer your question, ask your question. The webinar is scheduled to last for 1 hour, and we shall be sharing the recording and the presentation after the event. The webinar, as always, will be conducted in accordance with the Competition Act and relevant legislation. This means that any of the issues prohibited by the legislation will not be discussed during the webinar. So this webinar today is the second in a series of webinars which we at CPA are organising over the winter and spring. The webinars have a couple of purposes. One is to help us spread knowledge and information about key issues which affect CPA members and the plant hire industry and the construction plant sector generally. But they also help us understand what problems members in the plant hire sector are facing, what challenges those companies are facing. And potentially out of that, we get the opportunity to develop collective solutions which we can make available to many companies. Those collective solutions means that the challenges can be faced and answers put in place in a very cost-effective way. Today's webinar follows one which we held in November, which was about trade with the EU after transition. At that November webinar, we were asked a number of questions which we weren't able to answer at the time. We didn't have the technical expertise, and in fact, many of the rules and regulations hadn't been settled out or agreed. So we've asked Holly Tong of Brightfinch to come along today to help us understand what it is that hire companies need to know, and also to be able to explain what parts of the processes are actually still being developed. Holly is the director of Brightfinch Limited, a company providing customs consultancy and support services to businesses involved in international trade, in particular customs authorisations and supply chain solutions. Holly works with the Institute of Export and International Trade as a trainer and tutor, and is an International Chamber of Commerce registered trainer of Incoterms, that is, international contract terms. So that's all of the introduction from me. If you're good to make a start, Holly, I'll pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the intro, Kevin, and good afternoon, everyone. So, yeah, welcome in January to this new post-Brexit, post-transition world of trade. It's only been a few days, well, 2 weeks, just about. So what I'm going to do is predominantly just walk through what this actually means in practice now for moving goods into Europe and also back again. So I'm really focusing on just the customs and the documentation requirements and the border processes, which seems to be the predominant thing causing companies problems. There's a lack of understanding industry-wide a lot of the time in regard to what's needed to cross. So I'll talk you through what the different documents and references are, who's primarily responsible, but the really important point is just because the HMRC guidance says the haulier is responsible for making part of a declaration doesn't mean that a haulier is aware or is well equipped to do that. So it's really important if you're organising to move some goods across the borders that you fully understand who's going to be doing what, whether it's your responsibility or not. Otherwise, that's where you're going to encounter some problems. So hopefully this will be enlightening, and I'll get through the slides, I think, in it shouldn't take a huge amount of time. So we should have plenty of time for questions and answers towards the end, depending on any of your experiences today or any of your concerns before you're looking to do your first movement post-Brexit. So I will start sharing my screen now, which will hopefully bring up my presentation. Someone can just give me the thumbs up. Great. Okay, so just a little bit more background about myself, possibly before we begin. My background is in freight and logistics, so I'm very familiar with the customs roles and processes, which is how I wound my way back into consulting. So the last couple of weeks have been very interesting because I've ended up more back in that operational role, just helping various clients try to resolve problems. So I've really been very hands-on thus far in the process. So if you've got any specific kind of technical issues you've been struggling with, do let me know. Okay, so really what this all means since the 1st of January is in order for goods to cross borders, now we need multiple different documents, declarations and procedures in order to facilitate that movement. The first one is customs declarations. Now, one of the biggest challenges we seem to be having is for people to understand that this is a two-step process. If goods are moving from the UK to the EU, there is a requirement for a customs declaration to the UK authorities. There will be a requirement for a customs declaration as well to the EU authorities. A lot of people have seem to have misunderstood and thought the one declaration does both sides. It doesn't. So you're usually working with a UK party to make a UK declaration and an EU party to make an EU declaration. So I'm going to talk a little more about what that looks like and what is required, but just want to flag up some of these initially. For safety and security, again, that is a separate step of the process. There are some easements that I'll also cover on the UK inbound side for the next 6 months, but on the EU side, it was like a kind of hard change from the first. So at the moment, we are experiencing more challenges with the export of goods into the EU rather than the return of goods back into the UK. So we've got these two customs declarations that have to happen at either side. If the goods are going into the EU, we're also having a further safety and security message. And then what we also see is some extra border crossing processes, which are really more aimed at the hauliers, but I think it's just good to understand how it's all fitting together, because there's a lot of new acronyms flying around, and every kind of company I'm working with, different people seem to be doing different roles. Different people are responsible for different elements of these declarations. So it's really important that you understand that they're all going to get done. Okay, so if we just look at a typical export outbound movement, whether it's permanent export, temporary export, like most of yours would be, that's going to trigger an export entry in the UK. Generally, companies will appoint a customs agent to make that declaration for them. It's quite a complex form, and it has to be transmitted electronically to the customs chief system in the UK. Equally, there's nothing preventing an exporter from bringing that in-house, but we're generally only seeing that happening when exporters are exporting really high quantities of movements, like, you know, multiple trucks a week, to kind of justify training the staff internally and everything to do that. Otherwise, you can outsource to an agent, and you're looking at maybe a £50 declaration fee. And that's confirming to the UK authorities that goods have are leaving the UK, for what purpose, whether it's that they've been sold or temporarily exported and all the rest of it, the value of those goods, where they're going. And on an export entry, it's really all about also ensuring that we're not letting goods leave the country that aren't permitted to. There's export licenses for things like firearms and nuclear materials. So it's all part of the controls from the government. So that's the purpose that export declaration serves. So that's made, and there's different stages to that. So it can be lodged before the goods start moving, and then what follows is it becomes a status called arrived. And arrived means that those goods are ready for presentation to the authorities. So it then gets either permission to progress, so a kind of green light to allow those goods to leave, or it might be selected for some sort of examination or paperwork checks. So that's why it's really important that the person making this declaration understands what they're doing, and also the person moving the goods waits to be told that they have permission to progress. Now, the good thing is with the road freight, with the Ro-Ro traffic, because there's not really any controls yet at the Ro-Ro borders on the UK side, they're allowing that status to happen as soon as the export entry is made. So we're able to complete for Ro-Ro traffic arrived export declarations even before they arrive at the port of loading. And it just means that it's facilitating the flow of goods, because the goods are loaded, the agent can say, yeah, permission to progress, and then they can just be on their way. So that part gets the goods out of the UK. And that's definitely the easiest part of the process. Then the goods need to get into the EU. And to get into the EU, you need to evidence that 2 different types of declarations have been made. First off is the safety and security declaration. So a lot of companies just didn't have this on their radar. Safety and security message, I tend to explain, is a little like if you're flying somewhere and you're providing advanced passenger information. It allows the EU authorities to know, broadly speaking, what goods are coming in what truck and for whom. And they might have certain companies or types of goods descriptions and things flagged. And that's very much from a security point of view, ensuring nothing's being smuggled in. It's used for targeting, to identify, illicit movements. And then, of course, the goods have to be imported into the EU. So you're also looking for an EU import declaration to allow those goods to be moved in. And that's similar to the export in the terms of, is there a license needed to import it? What's the reason for bringing these goods in? Is it permanent? Is it temporary? All the rest of it. And also there is a tax collection element on the import side. Most imports will attract VAT, and that VAT rate would be based on the EU member state of import. So here we've got 20%, Belgium 21%, but it varies a little across the EU. And that's possibly going to be one of the biggest changes to the industry that you're in, because it looks like a lot of the hired equipment would attract an import VAT, but the company hiring it should be able to account for it and either reclaim it or just offset it on their VAT return, depending on how the VAT scheme is operated in that particular EU member state. Ireland, for example, have definitely introduced like a postponed VAT accounting, as we have in the UK, which means that it's just accounted for against someone in that country with a registered VAT number, but no one's having to outlay the cash. So they see a positive accrue and then a negative one once it's kind of reclaimed. So there shouldn't, in most instances, be huge cash flow implications. So in order to get to France, the goods can cross, but if those 2 things haven't happened, then they're not going to get released from Calais. And that's where you're hearing stories potentially of drivers being stuck in Calais for some time, because they've arrived, they've been able to get out of the UK, because we're not hugely even controlling our borders right now. But when they've got into the EU, they've not had what they need. In terms of who's responsible for the declarations, generally the person sending the goods, dispatching the goods in the UK is responsible for the export declaration. So it would be on them to appoint an agent or do that declaration themselves. Equally, the receiver is usually responsible for the import declaration in the EU. The safety and security is the responsibility of the carrier. So that's more often than not now for hires and things into Europe, maybe an independent haulage transport company who may or may not be particularly familiar with the need to make this declaration, which has also been evident with lots of confused calls, and the haulier can see they were responsible, but just assumed that the agent doing the export entry would do it. The agent doing the export entry, having seen it was the haulier's responsibility, didn't obtain the software and connections needed to make this declaration. And then you get someone stuck until they can find someone to push that declaration through. So that's what we're kind of looking at. And I'm going to come on to later, but then there's ways to kind of bind these declarations where then you're getting a green light before the goods are crossing to make sure everything's been taken care of. So if you're looking to send something out into Europe, see if you have a UK agent that can make the export entry, speak to who's hiring those goods, and understand if they're able to facilitate the import into the EU, make sure the transport company or whoever's moving those goods is able to make the safety and security declaration or contract it out at least. And then you've got all your reference numbers. It should go relatively smoothly. If for any reason you're wanting to take care of the European import side as well, that's also something that can be facilitated. A lot of the time, the UK export agent will work with a network of partners across Europe. So you could speak to the same kind of UK company and say, actually, I want to be able to like organize and pay for this whole process. And they'll be able to say, oh, right, yeah, we've got an agent in France and this is the information they're going to need to do that. So it's not a hard fixed who has to do what, but that's the general lay of the land. There's always ways to, take it a step further. Equally, you might say, well, I'll hire my equipment to a French company, but they've got to come and get it out of the UK. I don't want anything to do with that. So we're seeing a whole variety of attitudes from different industries. Some people want to take care of the whole thing to ensure that the goods get to their client okay, particularly more in the perishables and that sort of products. So, but that's the kind of message. UK export borders will be tightened up from July. And then that export entry MRN is definitely going to get like a hard check before the goods leave. And then, yeah, the EU checks are already fairly firm. So that's the export flows. I'm just going to pause in case anyone has any questions on this before we move on to the inbound flows and some of the border particularities.
Okay, thanks, Holly. If you do have a question, please either unmute yourself or if you're on video, wave your hand. We'll just pause a moment. And of course, you can also use the type it in chat function. Okay, Holly, I don't see anything coming in.
Yeah.
Of course, there'll be opportunity if you think of further questions to ask again at the end of the.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, back to you, Holly. Thanks.
So now I'm going to flip it to the inbound flow, where we see more easements. So we're having much less issues with inbound movements than outbound right now. The reason being it still needs an export declaration to get out of the EU. But in the UK, the safety and security piece doesn't need to happen until July. So we've got a temporary suspension on that requirement. And the import entries, if the goods were made in the EU, so this is a bit of a situation that you have to monitor slightly closely. If they're EU origin goods coming back into the EU, the import declaration does not need to be made for up to 6 months from the date of arrival. You would need to appoint an agent that was approved to defer the import entry, but that's why you'll find that there's very little in the press about like the UK inbound, because it's all just being allowed to flow. If it's Chinese origin or Swiss or something like that, then it's slightly more controlled. A declaration is required at the time of arrival, but there's still a way to do a simplified arrival declaration and follow that with a supplementary, which happens, the supplementary is always due the 4th day of the month after the arrival date. So it still buys the agent time to get all the paperwork they need from the importer and make that declaration in a kind of organized fashion, rather than, you know, the export movements where a lot of agents are getting calls like, oh, my driver's at Dover, I need this export entry, I need it done now. And it's kind of giving them no notice to prepare. So for now, import flows are much smoother. And as I was kind of discussing on the previous slide, we've also seen the introduction of postponed VAT accounting. So for imports that attract a positive rate of import VAT, usually set at 20%, the customs entry is still used, the import entry will still calculate that, but it just gets offset on the kind of quarterly VAT return or whatever the schedule is, and immediately offset again. So no money has to actually be paid to HMRC, assuming the person bringing those goods back is VAT registered. Equally, equipment going into the EU can often be returned as British return goods, which then just makes it a 0 VAT rated return anyway. We're still looking into the kind of most optimal tax way to do these movements, but as far as I can see so far, that's not going to be a huge issue. The more likely concern points will just be making sure the equipment doesn't get stuck anywhere, basically. Just so you know what we're kind of talking about when we're looking at these declarations. So this is a customs entry form. Now, this is more what the software spits out than how it's completed, but it's confirming who's trading the goods with who, how are they moving, and then all about the goods, including the value, the classification of them, the reason for moving them or trading them, and then on an import, the import tax collection as well. And you have to then keep repeating this. So if you've got a digger and some tools and something else, you know, that's multiple pieces of this section that has to be completed until you've exhausted all unique commodity codes. So this can happen like up to 99 times, which is why it can be quite a major job for a clearing agent, and they're working from a commercial invoice, trying to divide everything up by the relevant section of the declaration. And this entry in the UK is transmitted to Chief system. So that's an HMRC electronic system. So that's UK agents tend to have access to Chief. Then if you go to Ireland, you're usually working with an Irish agent who have connectivity to the Irish system, which is called AIS. In France, it's a different system, and so on. So that's why it's not possible usually for an agent sitting in the UK to be plugging in both sides of that declaration. It's why they're having to work with partners, because the license is needed to do this, and the software you need and everything, the rules of completion can be somewhat different. So that's the customs piece. It's the same form for import and export, and the only difference is on export, you're not getting into the tax calculation. The safety and security, if I flip back and forth there for a minute, looks kind of similar. And again, it's telling a very similar story. There's not much more you can say, to be honest, from the customs entry about the movement of goods. So it's still which traders are dealing with which goods, what are the goods, and how are they moving again. But this is being made in an entirely different software system from customs end. So the system's known as ICS, in the UK at least, the import control system. And therefore, that's why it's a separate declaration needed. On a UK export, and safety and security is actually wrapped up in the export entry. But for imports, it's always two independent declarations. So that's that piece. Just going to talk a moment about transit as well, because we're seeing massive demand for transit movement. So transit is where something holds T1 or T2 status. T1 is non-EU goods moving across the EU to a point of clearance. T2 is EU goods moving through a non-EU country. So we can use transit to move French goods through the UK into Ireland, for example, maintaining their EU free circulation status. We can also use transit to move UK goods through Calais and to a final destination before that customs import declaration needs to happen. So if the final destination is not France, most of the time what we're seeing is the need for a transit movement to be raised, and that's in addition to all the other stuff. So you still have an export entry out of the UK, but then you also have a transit movement. The transit movement allows those goods to arrive in Calais, for example, and not have to have an EU import entry at that point in time. So it means you can take care of everything you need to drive across Europe from the UK side. When they arrive at their destination point, at that point, an import entry is completed, and that allows the transit movement to be discharged. Because the transit is kind of like a pass to let the goods through a border without having a customs entry first, it requires a movement guarantee. So either the haulier or the importer or exporter would generally need to be providing a guarantee for that movement, because otherwise you could use transit, not do the import entry, not pay import VAT, never send the goods back, and then basically they've been smuggled into the EU. So that's why the system's in place, to prevent misuse of it. So for outbound goods in particular, a lot are currently moving out by transit. Equally, if you were sending equipment, for example, to Switzerland, you would use transit for it to move across the EU to get to another non-EU country. So transit is a scheme that's used technically a lot across a lot of the world, but locally with EU member states and also certain countries that are members of the Common Transit Convention. So that includes EFTA, your European Free Trade Association countries, such as Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein, countries like Turkey are in it as well, and the UK now. So only kind of local, but it just allows facilitation of the movement of goods through different customs territories. So hopefully that is clear. I'll just pause again. Is there any more any questions yet?
Nobody has raised anything on chat, Holly, and we'll just pause a moment to see if anybody raises their hand or unmutes themselves. No, all appears quiet. If you're good to carry on, please do so.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so if the goods are moving on transit, and this is another area that we've seen a lot of problems with, so just on the assumption that at least some of this equipment must be going out under that to get to a final destination. What we have is the introduction of what customs are calling inland border sites. So these are scattered, as you can see, from Dover up to Liverpool, and it's to avoid a massive collection of lorries at the port of Dover, basically. So for a normal export entry, we're having this arrival at the place of loading, and then they can go out. But if the goods are also moving on transit, what that means is the driver has to have the transit document processed at an office of departure or an approved site called a registered consignor site. And only when the transit is moved to an accepted status can the goods actually travel. So anyone using normal transit procedures is having a T1 raised. Anyone can raise that T1, like any agent or whatever. It needs a guarantee to raise it. And then the driver's being directed to one of these sites. So quite often it's near Ashford on the M20, but there are a few alternatives, as you can see from this map here as well. The driver presents some references, and then they get processed, and then he's told if he can move to Dover or not, or the Eurotunnel. So these inland border sites have caused much confusion. Not the intention of them, just you give the driver a T1 reference and he goes straight to Dover port and didn't realize he had to kind of check into one of these. So just to stress again, this is only if the goods are currently moving under transit. If it's just a straight export and import the other side, this is not necessary. Also, if it's going out of a more traditional port like Felixstowe, for example, or London Gateway or Southampton, this isn't necessary because there's already well-established border posts in those locations that understand how to perform the activities of an office of departure to check the movement raised and confirm it's okay to go. So this is really, again, aimed at the road traffic industry. So probably one maybe a bit more for the hauliers, but again, we're seeing a lot of confusion, and I think it would just be useful if you're all aware of it. There's a status checker, so you can see which ones are busy and which ones are not, to divert the driver to the one that's looking like it's gonna not hold him up for hours. So that's good to know. Any slides where there's a useful link, you'll see I've included the URL at the bottom of the slides that will be shared after this presentation to make sure that you have access to all this information, because HMRC do have a habit of just putting these new sites online, but no one knows. So as soon as you're aware that they're there, it can make life a lot easier. So that's giving you a good feel for how things are going. Northfield Airfield is a stop off the M25, so a good alternative to the Ashford sites if the driver happens to be going that way. As you can see here, there's only the Office of Departure and Destination is transit only, or also if for any reason you were able to raise a carnet for the goods, it will also perform stamping of the carnets back and forth. So that's what they're used for. Having looked into carnets in a little more detail, it looks like a lot of the time hired equipment is excluded, but the carnet conditions can differ from ATA country to country. So if you're looking at using carnets and accessing that convention, carnet is like a temporary passport for goods. Doesn't circumnavigate the need for any of the customs entries, but does give you like a complete avoidance of the import tax. There's some very set conditions. So the UK would exclude hiring of construction equipment, unfortunately, but other countries might allow it, and we haven't really had chance yet to do the full research picture on that one. However, the point being, if you need to check into one of these facilities, what you can do is book ahead. So if it was going out on a transit, you're looking for it to act as Office of Departure. And you would go, there's this website that I've included at the bottom here, and all you do is provide the departure request. You put your transit local reference number into that request, the driver's phone number, and when you think you're going to be there, and it just helps the site process that as quickly as possible. So all things that have seem to have been designed to try and facilitate all of this new processing as best as possible. We have had a number of strange queries coming out of these sites so far because a lot have been run by brand new staff into the roles. However, I think they're gradually getting into the rhythm. So that's that one. As I was saying, when you're getting into the EU side of things, you're required to have those two separate declarations, the safety and security declaration and also the customs declaration. Now, rather than having the driver, having to present one or the other and then being told he doesn't have enough, France have designed an envelope system that allows whoever, the haulier or the agent or even the exporter, it doesn't really matter, to put the reference numbers of both of those required declarations, the safety and security and the customs, or instead of the customs import, the transit can be used. It's like either or. Link it to here. So it's just a cut and paste twice. And then what you get is this envelope. So in a way, it's a bit more confusing because now you've created this whole other thing. But in theory, this barcode should be presented by the driver just through his phone or something. The French authorities see that, scan it, and instantly they see that both declarations are done against this reference and they let the driver pass. So this is what we're working with. Again, the website at the bottom there is available for you. To create the French envelope is optional but recommended. And that one, you don't need any software or a system access. It's just a free online service. So anyone can go in and do that part. But if you're sending, anything off with a driver, just the more of this sort of stuff he has with him, the better prepared he's going to be when he's arriving at the destination border. Equally, Ireland have a very similar system, but it's called pre-boarding notification rather than an envelope. Again, it's online, free to access for anyone, and you're confirming if you're moving into Ireland or out of it. And again, you're adding your customs declarations. Once you've added all the required customs declarations, you'll see here the PBN status gives you a good to proceed to check-in. So what you're finding is actually if you're trying to book on, say, Irish ferries from Holyhead to Dublin, they're requiring the PBN and they won't allow the driver to check in for that ferry crossing until this status says it's okay. So this is an Irish revenue system, and it's all just trying to make sure that all those declarations have been done before the goods get to where they're going. So there's a lot of references floating around, a lot of documents with barcodes. It is a highly confusing situation for a lot of people, but hopefully by kind of breaking it down, some of this will feel more familiar to you by the end. Because, we've got kind of requests coming in. I need a PBN, I need an envelope, I need an EAD, a TAD. It's lots of terminology to get your head around.
Thank you very much, Holly. I'll give you a short pause there. I think you've probably preempted what my question was going to be. We've had a question from a member of the audience asking about movement of goods from Northern Ireland into the Republic, and we've also had a question coming by email about moving goods from, let's say, England, Scotland or Wales into and out of Northern Ireland. But it looks like you're about to cover those subjects, right?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so some good news there. Goods in Northern Ireland are considered to be in free circulation status within the EU. So goods moving from Northern Ireland into any other EU member state can do so freely. No customs declarations needed. If they need to travel across the UK at some point, then you would use transit under T2 status. to move those kind of EU goods through non-EU and back into the EU again. But what they've done is they've kind of carved off from a customs perspective Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK, so that that there isn't a need for the border between, you know, Northern Ireland and Ireland. So yes, if you need to, if the equipment's in Northern Ireland, it can just go without control. Movements from Northern Ireland into the UK are also as simple as could be done. So there's no need for an import declaration on the UK side. It might still need a declaration to get out of Northern Ireland slightly, but the government was saying that wasn't necessary. And if you need to get goods into Northern Ireland, there's the kind of challenge point. So goods from the UK into Northern Ireland, if they're going directly, do not need an export declaration out of the UK, although because this is all very new, we're still finding some companies are being asked for them. Doesn't really hurt either way. But they go into Northern Ireland and then they do need an import declaration. And that import declaration is identifying if those goods are at risk or not. If they're going into Northern Ireland and you can demonstrate they're going to stay in Northern Ireland, then they shouldn't be at risk of going into the EU. If they are deemed to be at risk of going into the EU, then they're following a slightly different procedure. And this is all about, you know, the import taxes, because UK to Northern Ireland should be tax-free. But if it was UK to France, you know, there's duty on it. You prove your goods meet the rules of the trade deal, the duty goes away, there's still import VAT. So all of that side of things is trying to identify if the goods are just going to Northern Ireland or if they're going into the EU. If they're going into the EU, you're seeing it more like that movement from UK to France rather than UK to Northern Ireland, and the full procedures are kind of kicking in. Now, the good news is that for at least the next couple of years, the government are going to fully support and pay for any of those declarations that need to be made when it comes to Northern Ireland trade. So there is something called the Trader Support Service. It might be, oh no, we'll come on to that. And you can do a free login to a portal. And if you're sending some goods to Northern Ireland, the safety and security declaration is needed. You can draft it for free on here. And then if you need to do an import declaration, they're calling it an SFD. This is a simplified frontier declaration, so it's a very minimal declaration. And you can just upload a document, and basically a team that are funded by the government will process that on behalf of the trader. And that's to try and give facilitation and take away the costs for the new declaration requirements, just targeting UK to Northern Ireland trade. This is kind of how it looks from the TSS side. So they say a one-off registration, you submit some data, they make on your behalf a frontier declaration, the goods move, they get the reference okay to go, and then the TSS service will follow that up with a more detailed import declaration at some stage. They may touch base with the receiver, you know, in Northern Ireland to kind of get all the information they need to make that declaration. And then the traders are expected to kind of maintain an audit trail to prove that everything was accounted for correctly. So that's Northern Ireland. So so far I've had very little involvement in that, but some companies seem to be saying this is working well, others are having some trouble with the service. There's nothing to say you have to use this, but it's of course the cheapest option, as it's free. But you could still work with an agent in Northern Ireland if you had any concerns. So yeah, that's that. And then lastly, I think I just had this schedule of the commodity codes, where I had a look at a lot of construction equipment, and it's all sitting at a positive rate of import VAT, but a 0% rate of duty naturally. So it doesn't look like for the movement of a lot of hired equipment, you would need to be demonstrating that the rules of origin were met to access the UK-EU trade deal. Rather, you can just do a full import entry because it's not attracting duty anyway, that you would be otherwise trying to do your best to not pay. So in summary, that's kind of where we are really. So happy to take kind of any further questions, but hopefully it just gives you a bit of a feel for what's needed now to move those, move the equipment around, and yeah.
Thank
So
you. Thanks very much, Holly. There was a lot of information there, but I find it very helpful to start to build up a picture as to what the conventional movement regimes are. We've had one question come in from the floor, which you may have answered, at least in part, in your last piece of information about duty rates. And the question was from one of our participants who asked about any guidance on proof of origin. I know you spoke about rules of origin under the duty rates information. Does that cover that point?
a little, but I'm happy to expand on it. So we were all kind of waiting to hear what the content of the UK-EU trade deal was. There's lots of different types of arrangements between countries, and we've gone for quite a traditional trade deal, I suppose you would call it. So the reduction to 0% duties is only applicable for goods that were made in the UK or the EU. Everything else, say I was importing something from China and then sending it into the EU, and it was dutiable, I would have to potentially pay an import duty in the UK. And when I sent it into the EU, then maybe it would attract an EU import duty as well. So that would definitely have been relevant to the kind of equipment that you're dealing with, because I know it doesn't all originate from the UK or the EU, but it seems that most of it is naturally duty-free anyway. So you just don't have to worry about meeting any rules of origin. If you are dealing with something that does attract a positive rate of duty, then you're looking to identify, was it made in the UK or the EU, and therefore can it travel at a 0% duty? And if it was made, what sort of evidence are you holding and maintaining to prove that? And if you can't prove that, or if you know it definitely wasn't originating in the EU or the UK, then you would be looking at potentially paying a duty or trying to use some other sort of scheme to avoid it, if possible, on the basis that it was a temporary import. But a lot of the traditional ways of doing that do not seem to be available for hired equipment. So we will be kind of researching that in the coming weeks to understand if any of the kind of products that your members are dealing with would potentially attract a duty, and if so, what is the best course of action to take with that. I mean, it might be so low it's negligible and not an issue, but if the value of the equipment is very high, which I'm sure a lot is, then it might be that we need to look to see if there's anything that can be done.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Holly, for that. We've had another question in, which has come in on chat, and that is from Selena Wright. Thank you, Selena, for your question. How specific do we need to be with commodity codes? For example, we hire vacuum equipment, and a full kit would include lengths of PVC hoses. And looking at the commodity codes, the equipment was at 0%, but PVC hoses are at 6%. Do you have to list every single item on an invoice?
If it's moving out as independent items, then yes. But if you've put all those together to make one piece of equipment, you would be classifying the piece of equipment as a whole. Sometimes, depending on what the classification is of, say, the equipment, sometimes parts and accessories can be classified with it. Sometimes the tariff explicitly states that parts and accessories must be classified separately. So there's not really a general answer I can give on that. It would be a matter of looking into the exact type of equipment, the exact commodity code that held, and then what the rules associated with that are. But as a general rule of thumb, I suppose I would say better to classify everything. And as the theory goes, everything should have only one commodity code. There should be one correct commodity code for basically everything in the world. There's a lot of legal documents on the formal methodology of arriving at the correct commodity code. So a lot of people do just kind of log into the UK tariff and try and find the number. Maybe they're in the right section of the tariff, maybe not, and then you've got a whole bunch of specialists that are, providing services to companies that are not sure, who are able to then provide classification for them. So sometimes it comes down to your attitude and risk approach, but yeah, if you're sending out like 10 things, it's 10 different commodity codes to be listed, and on the customs declaration it's 10 different sections per commodity code. And the reason is that some of those commodities might be controlled and need an export license, some might not, some might attract duty, some might not. But definitely don't look at a whole bunch of different things and put it under one commodity code unless the tariff allows for that. There are lots of helplines. So if in any doubt, there is a free email for HMRC where you could email them and they will give you an opinion, but it's not legally binding. So if they didn't get it right, it's still on you. You can take it a step further and apply for a ruling to for HMRC to say this is the code you're going to use for the next 3 years. And then you have absolute certainty, but it's a slightly more long-winded process. Or you can, work with kind of chambers of commerce, provide classification service, independent consultants, and those sort of people, where you could get a kind of expert opinion on it. So that's where there's kind of no excuse for getting it wrong, because customs have already put a lot of free information available online. The formal rules across the world are called the general interpretive rules, and they basically say you're looking for an exact match, and after that you're looking at what it does and then what it's made from. So there's that kind of logical advancement through the tariff.
Okay, thanks, Ali. So for frequently occurring packages of equipment, such as an excavator with different ancillary items like different buckets or different attachments, which would be fitted to the front of the excavator, there's some work maybe which we could do as a trade association to set up what the standardized answer is and advise our members to say, if you treat it like this, understanding is you won't have any difficulties.
I think if in that sort of example it was pieces that bolted onto a piece of equipment but might not all be bolted on at the same time, that would be classed as one commodity code because it's all moving together.
Right. Okay. Thanks. There's some more work to do on that, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Holly, for that. So we've had some other questions come in, and there's certainly some questions from us from the association's point of view. This doesn't look as straightforward as we would have liked it to have looked, I have to say. So what sort of advice would you give to a small organization which is looking to trade into the EU without any serious complications? Is this something which in the long term they might look to bring the competence to deal with all of this, bring the competence in-house? Or is it something which you think is, at least for the foreseeable future, better being dealt with by independent consultancies and import-export agencies?
I mean, certain pieces of it can quite easily be brought in-house. It only takes one person at a small firm to spend a bit of time getting familiar with the tariff and reading the footnotes and things to feel like they're pretty confident in knowing what they're talking about. So there isn't usually a need to outsource kind of every single tariff classification. But what you do use a consultant for is if you want to get strategic about it and you're saying, well, I've got a problem here because I'm pretty sure this is the tariff code. And a consultant will take a look and say, actually, no, I think we can put an argument forward for a different code to be used. We'll run it through HMRC to kind of get the binding opinion. But if you're having a problem with a positive duty rate, sometimes the consultant will just say, sorry, no go, like that is the code, and that's the end of the story. But a lot of products do fall into kind of slightly grey areas, so that's where you would do that. I've spoken to so many companies that thought they would be doing the declarations themselves, went on training to do it, got even software potentially, and then just decided it was an absolute headache of a job. So I think in the short term, at least, my recommendation is to use an agent. They're familiar with the processes. When you send an entry to Chiefly, a lot of the time you get error messages back, and then the agent needs to understand what they mean, make sure the customs formalities are taken care of properly, that all the export entries are kind of checked out of the country, and reacting to any of those kind of selections for paperwork exams and things. So unless someone's already familiar with that, it's a bit of a jump to bring it in-house. The software can be thousands of pounds as well, so it's quite often much cheaper to use an agent as well. All the agent usually needs is a clear idea of what's traveling when and how, and a commercial invoice and maybe packing list to support that. So it's not totally arduous to appoint one, but a lot are very busy right now.
Yes, I'm sure they are very busy right now. And if one of our members were to seek to find an agent and appoint an agent, is there any advice that you would give to them about in terms of how to go about that? Is there a sort of registration scheme or a trust mark scheme or check a trade or something like that?
Yeah, there's not exactly like that, but there is a list of agents that agents can register to be on a government website. So I'll share that with you after this, and it can go out with the presentation. Most agents will also be members of the British International Freight Association. And that website is better because it allows you to narrow down your search to geographical areas or the type of goods that agent specializes in. So then you don't end up with a list of kind of hundreds of companies. Most agents are able to make declarations across the UK, so that part doesn't really matter where they're based. But quite often it's nicer for companies to be working with another local company in case they want to meet, run through, understand each other a little better. So, and also what we have is authorized economic operator status, which is something a lot of agents are going for now. And so they might have it, they might be working on it, but it's the equivalent of an ISO 9001 type accreditation, but it's issued by HMRC to compliant agents. So if an agent had neither BIFA registration or AEO, I'd be at least asking questions to make sure they knew what they were doing. If they have one or the other, they're probably fairly sound, and both even better. So that's what I'd recommend. So I can share the BIFA link as well with you.
Okay, that's very helpful. Yeah, and thank you very much, Holly, and for everybody else who didn't capture all of that. We will be sharing the notes and the presentation of this webinar after the event, and also the recording of the event, so you can catch up on all of that now. Now, I know there's been a couple of quotes, a couple of questions coming in from the floor. If you're still okay for a bit more time, Holly, I think Brian Jones would like to ask a question. Brian, if you're online, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead, please.
Okay, thanks, Holly, and thanks again for all the fantastic information that you've given everybody. I'm not sure if this is the right time to ask this, because today's presentation that you've told us all about is mainly to do with the goods side of our business, getting the goods in and out of the UK. Is there any other information available? Because I'm sure some of our members and others that's on this webinar are interested in especially with our operated plant companies, who will send their operators along with the goods, say, into France. Therefore, they're going to be working in a EU country. And with erection teams, with our cranes and servicing teams, who will be going over in vans full of tools, etc. Is there any information sort of over and above sending the goods over that our guys can get for their employees as well?
I believe there is some guidance online, and I'll see if I can find the links. Honestly, on my side of the spectrum, just keeping up with what the goods need is more than the time I have available. So I haven't been hugely involved in the rest of it. The tools going out with people would usually travel under a carnet to allow them to temporarily go into different countries without needing to be imported. Although maybe you get away with a van for a few months, I don't know how. Carnet would probably be the safer approach, but what the actual people need to be working abroad, I would presume some sort of temporary permit or something, or maybe they can only travel for so many days, but that's unfortunately a little outside of my field.
No, that's okay. All right, thanks for that. If you could share the link, and then the CPA can send it out.
No problem.
Thanks again.
Thanks, Holly, and thanks, Brian. I'm very conscious of the fact that we now actually have run out of time, and I'm very grateful to Holly for diligently speaking for the best part of that hour, quite solidly on all of that technical content. I'm sure there are many more questions. I know we've had some come in on the chat, which will encapsulate, and with your permission, Holly, I'll get those emailed through to you, and we'll take those offline. So unless there's any last comments from yourself, Holly, or any other issues coming in from anybody else, I'm going to start to draw the event to a close. So I think the most important thing is to say, Holly, that was great. There's so much to this, and you made it sound so straightforward. And I'm sure there are many, many things that would not have been as clear unless we'd had the opportunity to listen to you help us navigate through that. So thank you very much to you for that. Thank you to everybody else for coming along here today. If you do have any further questions, you can email them directly to me, kevin.minton@cpa.uk.net, or to any of my colleagues, Chris.Castley, or Adam.Godwin, or David.Smith, all at cpa.uk.net. We shall be posting, as I mentioned before, the presentation, the recording of the webinar, and various other resources on social media, and you'll be able to get links to those through the CPA website. I think that draws me to a close, unless there's any other issues from my colleagues or from Holly. We are done. The next webinar will be on Thursday, the 21st of January, which will be about reducing emissions and our path to a zero carbon future. That webinar will be supported by Jen Quick Groundhog. I look forward to seeing many of you on there. So thank you all for attending. Stay safe. The webinar is now closed.